Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello and welcome back to the show. Our skin is quite the remarkable organ that envelops us, and while we often focus on the cosmetic aspects of skin aging, be it those pesky wrinkles or age spots that seem to appear overnight, there is a whole universe of cellular and molecular processes at play. And this week, we're delving into the intricacies of skin aging and longevity, exploring how dermatological science intersects with the broader field of longevity and what this means for our quest to not only live longer, but also to thrive in our later years. And to guide us through this is dermatology professor Daniel Butler, who also serves as Assistant Dean of Student Affairs at the University of Arizona. So welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and discuss all this with you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here. I see lots online about skincare all the time, and I always take it with a grain of salt because, misconceptions and misinformation can go really far if you don't do that. But before we begin, I would love for you to tell us a bit about your background and what compelled you to pursue dermatology and medicine.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. You know, a little bit about my background is I was a little lost when I was in medical school, and I thought I was going to be a surgeon with really no background supporting that. And when I actually had to come and make the decision of what I was going to do, I had to do this really intense self-reflection of like what's important to me and how do I want to get my true essence across to patients. And the main thing for me was dealing with patients who are aging. And so I ended up shadowing a geriatrician who's, a doctor for older adults. And when I was in that clinic, it was interesting because these older adults would come in with tons and tons of really serious medical conditions. But the thing that worried them the most or concerned them the most was often their skin, whether it was a spot on their skin or a symptom of their skin, like itching, there was a lot of concern. So as a medical student, I then shifted my attention over to dermatology to see, hey, what's going on in the aging field of dermatology? And as you've alluded to, almost everything in dermatology at that point was anti-aging. And I thought, well, this is interesting. There's an entire a field of people who need, whose skin is aging and there's this inevitable aging process. And yet, the entire field is built on reversing that or sort of perpetuating this idea that we can reverse it. And that paradox of a field that treats a ton of aging patients, but also claims to anti-age, that paradox was what fascinated me. So I've been on a wild run since then. It's been a blast. And I will be for the rest of my career trying to understand how aging and time influence our skin, and specifically the diseases of the skin, the things that we see on our skin that we don't like, and then more broadly, how our systems, how healthcare systems, how cosmetic industry come in and then influence our understanding and our interaction with our skin, and this inevitable but accepted yet partially preventable process of aging. So I think it's a really interesting soup of science and culture, and I've been interested ever since.
For sure. I love how you described it as a soup. It really is such a soup. So, what can you tell us about some of the common misconceptions about skin aging, which you've already alluded to the fact that there isn't such a thing as anti-aging.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest misconception is that there's sort of one side of the story, and that one side is anti-aging. So, I don't like to talk like I'm an. This is going to sound weird, but an anti-ager. I love that idea. I love the idea of a lofty goal of, hey, we're going to try to reverse this condition or this progression that really, frankly, nobody likes from a visual standpoint when it's not going well. But that's not the only side of the equation. There's another side of aging and the skin that is wonderful and acceptable. And of course, it's not always the visual, but what we have to understand about aging is that there's not just the negative side. Aging is relationships and experiences and time with loved ones. And there's sort of that side of the equation that I think is should be honored and holistically appreciated. And the nice thing is that it's not a zero sum game. Like you can be sort of on the side of anti-aging and enjoy reversing some of the parts of the visuals of our skin that we don't like, but also appreciate the honest nature, the inevitable nature of aging, and find ways to enjoy it. And as much as it sounds odd, as those things are not that far apart. So like a great example and something that I really like to talk about is skincare regimens. So a lot of the times people think skincare regimens are sort of one-sided, right? They're what's the best skincare regimen for anti-aging? And I actually like to put it on both sides of that equation, which, yes, you want something in your skincare regimen that's going to help with the anti-aging aspect, but you also want something that's going to be enjoyable, that's going to make it fun to pass the time, that you're going to look forward to, whether it's, a 1 hour deluxe, I'm going to cloak myself in this wonderful skincare regimen, or whether it's a 10-second, I'm running out the door skincare regimen. You want to be able to balance both of those. And so, I know I'm jumping the gun here as far as skincare regimens, but the best skincare regimen tackles both of those. It allows you to reverse some of those signs that you don't love, or at least tries to do that. But also it's an enjoyable experience for you as you're inevitably aging.
Yeah, that's an excellent preface for our topic for today. I'd love to know so much more. I have so many questions planned, but before we go further into detail, I would love to get to know you better as well. So, this is Have You Met Daniel? And my first question for you is, what is your favorite book?
There's a book about that really hits on the sort of the history of medicine and some of the challenges in medicine, called The Tennis Partner, that I really, really love. It dives into some of the features of medicine that I think are truisms, which are, about caring for others and empathy, but also being challenged. So I think that's one that if you haven't read it, it's definitely worthwhile, whether you're in medicine or not.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And as for movies, have there been any that you've enjoyed recently?
Ooh, can I pivot and go to shows? I've been on
Sure, yeah.
shows. Okay. um we have a newborn at home, so our time is limited, so these like 45-minute shows are right where I am mentally. So we're into White Lotus. I don't know if you're a White Lotus fan, but I love White Lotus. It's like the best caricature of humans. It's such a great way of exposing human nature. And then I'm a huge sports fan, so I just rewatched the Last Dance, which is the Michael Jordan documentary, and it is just so well done. I've absolutely loved that.
Oh, what do you like about that Michael Jordan documentary?
Ooh, where to begin? I will be honest. I'm a little down on sports documentaries because most of them are, sort of self-produced, and you kind of get this glorified version of the person. And I know that documentary was definitely a little bit of that, but to see something that was so culturally important for really a generation or two, and see it almost how they did it at the same time. I don't know if you've watched it, but they do, the last season while they're detailing, 10, 20 years before of all the different characters, Michael, Scotty, Dennis Rodman. So I think those two things, and just seeing something that was so culturally important for, basketball, which is a game I love and stink at playing. But something that was, globally a phenomenon and really sort of raised, that part of the global culture, almost single handedly with that one team and one player.
Yeah, I'm not a basketball fan, but if I was, I would. It sounds like I would be really excited about it. And what about podcasts? Are there any that you're listening to at the moment?
Um, I try to listen to something that keeps me up to date on current events, but sometimes that's challenging. So I do like to listen to The Daily in the mornings, which is a New York Times podcast. I do love, there's a professor who talks about mentoring and economics. His name is Scott Galloway, and he has a podcast called the Prof G podcast, which is a really popular podcast here in the States. And I love his take on mentoring, and then I apply a lot of his academic takes, which are a lot of sort of mentoring, how to make sure someone is optimized, and try to bring it to my students and my trainees in medicine. He's more economics, but I like his takes on those topics.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting one. And what about role models? Is there anyone that you look up to either in your professional life or your personal life?
Ooh, this is a great one. Yes, I have two easy answers, and you'll have to stop me because I can talk about these people forever. And if anybody is looking for mentorship, I mean, there's nothing that's been more impactful for me than great mentors. So I have a mentor. His name is John Koo. He's a professor of dermatology at UCSF. And if I have to be short about him, he's just a lover of life. And what he's done with his love of life is he's able to transfer that to his mentees. And it's like he gives you a light, and I can't explain how impactful that's been for me, but he basically gave me that. And I think about him every time I'm interacting with a patient, every time I'm talking with someone about my passion. We don't study the same thing, but just his interest in others and his interest in the skin is something that is a gift that he shared with me, and something that I'll never be able to repay. And then the other person I look up to is actually Jamie Foxx, the actor. I promise there's a reasoning behind this, but if you've never heard his stories, they are unbelievable. And his background, he comes from sort of a small town in Texas, and he was actually a concert pianist growing up. And he's got some amazing stories about that. And then he was a college football player, and then he became famous as a comedian. And then of course, the guy has gone on to win Grammys and Oscars. I mean, the guy is so wildly talented, and he's just a great example of someone who can do so many things, and who's so fun to watch their essence transfer either onto a screen or in a song or through comedy. And I just, there's not many people like that, and I love following him.
Yeah. Well, those are some incredible picks right there. My last question for you is: has there been a course or a class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this day?
Ooh, that's a good one. A course or a class that has stuck with me. Yeah, I will say, and it's probably not for the reasons that you would think. So we had an immunology class when I was in medical school, and I thought it was so interesting. And I remember I studied so hard and looked at all these what we call cytokines, which we can get into later. These molecules that are all over the body that have these effects on other cells, and it's sort of the communication or the chatter of the immune system. And that was, now about, I'll probably date myself, but 15 years ago. And why that class sticks with me is that in the last 15 years, almost everything I learned in that class is gone or has been advanced, or we understand more about it. And so I think about that all the time. And I talk about that with all my students about how the only thing that's inevitable is change and progress and more understanding. And we can't get frustrated by that. Like, it's okay that we learned those things and then we progressed. And I think it's a great lesson for us as in academics, certainly, where there's constant shedding of information for new information, but also just as people, as friends and spouses and family members, is like, no, things are going to change and we all evolve. And it's so important to keep that in mind as we age.
Yeah, it's a real testament to how far we've come as a collective.
No question.
Yeah.
No question.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. It has been such a pleasure to get to know you, and I've really enjoyed myself. But now let's move on to getting to know a bit more about skin aging and longevity and how they come together. For starters, how would you define longevity?
How would I define longevity? So, I think of longevity a little bit differently. So I think longevity, most people think of as living as long as you possibly can. And I like to put an asterisk on that, which is it's existing in a state for as long as you can enjoy it. And I think the enjoyment piece is the part that's often missing from the longevity discussion. But that's usually how I define it: existing in a state that's enjoyable for as long as you can.
Right. You're so right about that. What's the point of living a few extra years if you are struggling to do anything effectively?
I would just say I'd add to that. I'll tell you a brief story. My grandfather. I lost him a couple years ago, but he lived till he was in his 90s, and I will tell you, he all he liked to do was watch sports, and he barely moved for the last 2 years of his life, and the man was so happy. He was so happy just being around family and watching his sports from his couch. And, for him, that was longevity. And I know other people who, if that was their state of life, they would be like, this is not a state of existence that I'm enjoying. So, I think it's to each his or her own.
Yeah, for sure. My grandma was the opposite of your grandfather, where she used to cook for the family on a daily basis. So when she was unable to physically cook that regularly anymore, it really frustrated her, and she in fact resisted quite a few times and insisted on making dinner, and sometimes would even go ahead and do it anyway, even if we insisted that she didn't, for her own health. So yeah, there's a spectrum of people like that out there. But secondarily, how would you define skin and also skin aging?
Yeah, skin aging, I think, as we alluded to at the beginning, sort of has two pieces. There's the visual of skin aging, which is, as you mentioned from the beginning, more, sort of colloquially, it's wrinkles, sunspots, which, the medical term is lentigines. It's loss of fat, particularly in the face, which can change some of the facial structure. Those are the main ones that, from a skin aging visual standpoint, are very significant staples. And then there's the skin aging that's sort of an inevitable piece to this, which is more basic science. It's changes of the immune system of the skin, how we respond to our environment. Things like changes of the barrier. So the barrier of our skin is this really complex mix of structures and cells that ultimately protect our skin from the outside world. And as we age, that skin barrier changes. It doesn't always get more porous, but it certainly has a harder time recovering, almost like thinking about a 30-year-old working out versus an 80-year-old working out. There's differences in how they're going to respond to doing, 25 squats or something like that, or a 2-mile walk. There's so many other levels to that, but I would say that those are the two pieces. I think there's the visual signs of aging, and then there's sort of what's going on at a molecular level. And the reason why the molecular level is so important is that has some pretty significant implications to skin diseases as we age, and some of the things that we feel that aren't necessarily, sort of the visuals that we target from our skincare regimens or, potentially cosmetic treatments.
For sure. And as a dermatology professor, what would you say is the importance of understanding our skin and the science behind it?
I have a complex relationship with this question because, I like to, obviously my job is to make sure people are aware of their skin, but, I also want people to not be so aware of their skin all the time. There's everything we do is a conflict in some regard. The greatest example of this is being out in the sun, right? So every dermatologist says, wear your sunscreen, wear your sunscreen, wear your sunscreen. And that's sort of preventing you from getting exposure to the sun. And my discussion with patients with this is like, you want to make sure that you have a balance of sun exposure or direct sun exposure, and protection. And that's the biggest and most important thing. So back to your question of how important is it for us to know about, skin aging, is it's really depends on you and where your balance lies. If it's something that you're really interested in, or something that really bothers you from a symptom standpoint or from a visual standpoint, then absolutely dig in. But for a lot of people, as I know this podcast talks about all the time, longevity may have nothing to do with the skin for many people, and that's fine. And sometimes those people who don't think about the skin at all have wonderful skin. So there's always sort of, I know I'm speaking a little bit in circles there, but it's not a direct question, and it's not a direct answer, because every single person has a different relationship with their skin and how aging is important to their skin.
Yeah, it's really hard to give prescriptive advice on what you should be interested in or not. Definitely. But what would you say is the relationship between skin aging and longevity?
Yeah. Well, I like to be a little bit dramatic here and say, the skin is our greatest window into our aging, and it's not necessarily that it gives you the whole story when you look at the skin, but I do think that there's a piece of the visual of our skin and how it's, and that it's the organ that we interact with our environment, with which we interact with our environment. And thus it tells a little bit of the story of aging. And I always have my residents and my students take a look at someone's arm. So you can look at someone's forearm, the dorsal forearm, the sun exposed forearm, and then you can have them look at the back of the forearm or the inner forearm. And the variation between those two things can tell you how receptive someone is to the sun. And that can tell you, just by looking at a forearm, a lot about how someone is aging. It doesn't give you the whole story, but it certainly is a piece of it. So I do think that there's a lot to it. And I do think that the skin has become, as you've alluded to, a really important part of self-care. And I do believe so strongly in the importance of self-care for this pursuit of longevity and this pursuit of healthy aging. And I do think, no question, the skin is a very important part of that. And of course, that's different for every person, but no question that it's a definite part.
Yeah, now I'm really conscious about my forearm. So, what are the fundamental aspects of skin that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so fundamentally, I think, it's the basics. So I think the structure of the skin is a really important one. So you have your top layer of the skin, that's the epidermis. That's often where things like dryness, some color changes of the skin, some differences in color of skin tone. That all shows up in that top layer of skin. Underneath that is a lower layer called the dermis. The dermis is more of a structural, functional layer. And so that gives that's almost like the scaffolding. And that's often where you'll see changes as we age. The dermis is where you'll see things like wrinkles develop. You'll see loss of structure develop. And then you have your bottom layer of the skin, which is your fat layer. Everybody has a fat layer. And this is also where you'll start to lose some of that strength of that fat layer. Often, you'll see more sinking around the eyes or jowls because you're starting to see some of the loss of that function. So those are some of the structural pieces of the skin, and then also how aging and the effects of aging can be visualized in damage or changes to each one of those structural layers.
Yeah. So what happens to the skin when it ages in these different layers?
Yeah. So let's start at the top. So the epidermis, which is really responsible for that barrier that we talked about. So it loses some of its ability to produce fat. It loses some of its ability to turn over. And these are critical functions to maintaining that barrier. And what that ultimately does is it makes your skin a little bit drier, and it can also change some of the color of the skin, like you often see with sunspots. In the deeper layer, you start to lose some of the collagen or elastin, some of these structural scaffolding pieces, and that can lead to wrinkles or changes in the architecture of the face, how our smile may pull in a certain direction. And then the last layer, as we talked about, is the fat layer, and that's where we can get distribution in a way we don't like. So sometimes that's increasing fat in a way that we don't like, but a lot of the time, certainly on the face, that's where we'll see changes in the fat distribution in ways that, don't accentuate us in the right ways. Sometimes it's, you don't want as much of, this cheek hanging lower, or you want more structure on the top of your face. So these are all ways that age has an impact on the layers of our skin. And let me just clarify, each one of those things that I just described is like its own basic science career. So I'm just going over each one of them at a really broad stroke, but we could dive into those in independent week-long podcasts.
Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit about collagen and elastin. How do these factors play a role in our skin aging?
Yeah, so collagen and elastin are what give us the sort of strength of our skin. It gives us, again, I like that analogy of scaffolding. So it's basically like the structure or the foundation of your house. And as we age, if you're thinking about your collagen is almost like the wood or foundation of your house, as that starts to creak and starts to change in structure, you start to see some change in the house. You start to see some movement of the foundation or some bending of the foundation. And so when that foundation bends, you start to see grooves that form. And that's where both static and dynamic wrinkles come from. And what I mean by static and dynamic is a static wrinkle is a wrinkle that's there all the time. No matter if you're moving your face or not, those wrinkles are there. Those are typically considered sort of like the end stage wrinkles. And then there's dynamic wrinkles as well, which is, okay, I have used my face in a way for so many years that now I've developed wrinkles in these areas. Most famously, you have these on your glabella between your eyes or between your eyebrows. Not you specifically, Marie, you're perfect. But everybody has these, what we call 11 lines. Those are typically dynamic wrinkles or rhytids. And those are created by that structural collagen. And as we age, that becomes more solidified and they become a little bit more fragmented and weak.
Yeah, no, I definitely am starting to form these this 11 figure, like I'm already seeing a little bit of a dent, because I found a lot, which it's a recent revelation, maybe perhaps a tad bit too late, but yeah, it's certainly there in other lighting conditions, but we see a lot on skincare products that claim to provide our skin with collagen, or I'm not sure if I've seen any with elastin actually, but I've definitely seen them with collagen. Can you tell us how that works? How effective that is?
Well, that's a great question. How effective it is sort of a mystery that's out there. So I'll give you a little bit of a background story, which is so like academics who study skincare, it's almost a separate but connected group than the skincare industry. And I actually love that combination. I think it's really healthy, and I think it grows. It grows together, but I think they have very different outcomes. The academic community is really looking at diseases, profound diseases that are affecting things like collagen and elastin. And then, the skincare industry is looking at these more micro changes related to aging. And so I think sometimes when when someone's looking for an answer of like, oh, okay, how can I figure out what elastin or collagen is? I always like to give that context, because there's like the study of, the mutation where someone has completely defective collagen, which is an actual disease. And then there's what we see of collagen of aging, which is more commonly discussed, at least in the more cosmetic and skincare realm, which is what I would describe as more nuanced, a little bit more idiosyncratic. What are the outcomes with these patients? These are visual scales. So I know, again, I'm not giving you the perfect answer, but I always like to give that context, because the question of how much does it work can depend on who's studying it and what the ultimate outcome of that visual is. So when you're asking about, skincare regimens and what additives work and don't work, I will tell you, there is way more promised than is actually delivered. And so when you said at the beginning, Marie, hey, I'm always taking things with a grain of salt, I think that's a really healthy way to approach it. That's probably a healthy way to approach all claims in life. But specifically in this world, is you want to make sure that you're skeptical when, big promises are made. They're certainly trying to sell you something. But that said, I do have a lot of belief in those products. I think there's a lot to those nuanced formulations that, number one, attack structurally something in your skin, whether that's what we call interstitial support, something like hyaluronic acid moisturizers, or a retinoid or a retinol, a synthetic retinol, or something that's added like a vitamin C. Those all are targeting really important pieces of dysfunctionally aged skin. But at the same time, you have to understand that these are not magic erasers. They're not going in there completely changing your skin. Not that you would want that either. And so I think subtlety and nuance is the way to approach what these products can actually do for you. And then thinking about them more holistically is usually what I'll recommend for patients, which is think about what they're targeting and how they make you feel when you're using them as part of a skincare regimen. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, but I think it's important to have those pieces combined whenever you're talking about, is this single product going to fix my collagen or my dyspigmentation or my dry skin?
Look, I think the perfect answer is one that's answered in truth. So, in my books, that's a perfect answer. And it gives us a lot of insight as to what we should be considering when we see all of this, when we see all these claims made online and when we purchase skincare products. So, I really appreciate that. But I'd love to talk about some external factors as well, like UV radiation. I'm aware that, wearing your sunscreen, like you said before, it's the number one thing that a lot of dermatologists say. So could you give us a little bit of insight as to how these external factors affect our skin and its aging as well?
Yeah. So, aging is not just the passage of time, which I think you've alluded to there, which is a really, really a keen observation. And I know it may be obvious, but it's a huge part of this puzzle. So yes, time has its own effect, but what does time actually mean? And it's really exposure to these potentially harmful things like UV radiation, which also has many benefits too. So I'm putting that asterisk out there. So UV radiation is one. Oxidative stress is another, which is these stressors that hit your skin from UV radiation damage, from pollution. These all impact the cells of your skin and can fundamentally change them. And then, chemicals can do this as well. So these are all sort of the external factors of aging that over time you're going to get repeated exposure to. And what they ultimately do is they stress your cells. So one way that they do this, so UV radiation, what it does is it actually penetrates the cell and it damages the DNA. And when that DNA is damaged, it, number one, can change how that cell behaves. So, your DNA is sort of your programming of how you behave from a cellular level. So it can change how that cell can behave, both from a small standpoint, it can make it so the cell doesn't divide as rapidly, or from a more dangerous macro level, it can turn it into a cancerous cell. So that's one way that it can do it. And number two is it can create more of those free radicals or that oxidative stress. These are small molecules that can then go and affect other cells. So it's almost like you get damage to one cell, it releases free radicals, and then they go to the other cells. And that's what we call oxidative stress. And that can happen with chemicals, pollution as well.
So, what is your advice for the average person when it comes to counteracting all of that repeated exposure to chemicals, UV radiation, etc.?
Yeah, you're kind of getting my ethos here when it comes to aging. So I'll give you my sort of like annoying eye rolly answer first, which is like, don't worry too much about them. If you start to internalize all the things that are affecting your skin all the time, it's almost like overwhelming. It's like sun, pollution, all these things. All of a sudden, it's like you're under constant attack, which is partially true. But first is don't internalize at all. The next one, if we can get really simplistic, is just find a sunscreen that you love that you're going to put on every day. And I know that sounds silly, but I promise you, just like, finding a loved one, there is a sunscreen out there for everyone. Sometimes it's a tinted sunscreen, sometimes it's a sunscreen with a certain texture to it. Everybody should have a sunscreen that they like to use to put on sort of these high value areas, specifically the face, sometimes the tops of the hands, where you certainly want to prevent having some of these damaged particles affecting your skin, and also where you're going to get the most sun. So I think that's my sort of easy first tip to that. I can give you a couple others of my sort of simplistic longevity skin regimen, but if we're just talking about avoiding and preventing some of the damage of UV or free radicals, I think that's a very easy starting point.
Yeah. And a lot of the time, like I alluded to in my introduction, when we talk about skin aging, we discuss the cosmetic side of it. So I was wondering, what are the lesser known dangers of, no, I wouldn't want to say dangers per se, but like, what are some of the lesser known challenges, I suppose, when it comes to skin aging, that just aside from cosmetics?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest one is consistency and simplicity. So what I mean by that is when you're in what I call a desperation market, which is everybody's trying to anti-age or to not look as old as they don't want to look. The hardest thing is now you're in a system, and this has been true even before social media and sort of the onslaught of advertising of the anti-aging world, is everyone was getting a promise from this friend and that friend and telling them to do this and that. And what happens is people end up buying 4, 5, 6 skincare products. They use them. They hear about the new thing. They buy another 4, 5, or 6, and they sort of keep that cycle going. And then they get burned out. They don't do anything for a while. Then they start feeling a little worse about their skin. And then the cycle starts over. So you have to remember that all the factors that contribute to aging skin are all long-term factors. Yes, you can get one sunburn and that can have an effect, but really it's consistent over sun exposure. It's consistent exposure to these chemicals or pollutants that are going to irritate your skin that are going to give you those undesirable effects of visual aging. And so if you can remember that, hey, if I just stay consistent and block some of those with some sunscreen or an antioxidant or some good moisturizer, as much as I can be consistent with that, I'm going to prevent that cumulative effect that happens from this sort of binge cycling. And it's probably going to save me a lot of money too, because I'm going to oversimplify it to just a couple things that I really like. Doesn't always have to be the same product for 20 years, but something that has the desired effect for you, whether that's sun blockage or an antioxidant. You just want to be consistent with it. So my way of explaining that to people is, if you can get a hat that you wear on a sunny day, if you can get a really good sunscreen that you like, you're halfway there, as long as you're using both of them a majority of your days. And then, there's some cherries on top as well if you want to really sort of step it up.
Yeah. And what's the benchmark for consistency? Just because I am a female and wear makeup on a regular, well, not really regular basis, but on some days I do wear makeup, and it is very disruptive to the face to reapply sunscreen, which I've heard is really important. So yeah, I would love to know what consistency looks like, especially because we can't really see consistency beforehand. We can only really see the effects afterwards.
Totally. Great question. And I would put it in the rhetorical question category. So you've really challenged me with that one. But consistency is really a unique thing for everybody. And it alludes back to what your ultimate goal is. If someone does not want to age whatsoever, like Nicole Kidman is a great example. Like, she is ageless and she has very light skin complexion, but she has been a stalwart for wearing sunscreen almost every day. Like, that is her benchmark for consistency. But I have other people who, they work inside. They're pretty. They don't see a ton of sun exposure, and consistency for them is to remember to wear their hat, when they're out surfing or going out for a hike. So that's consistency for them. So, I think embedded in your question is a really keen self-awareness of, where do you want to be? And I will tell you, maybe the easy answer here is, I don't want to age at all. And I think in that, my answer would be, well, you're going to age no matter what. But if you really want to prevent every sign of visible aging, your benchmark should be to wear sunscreen every day and physical blocking with a hat, as much as you are in direct sun exposure. So that's a really high benchmark, but a one that I would set for someone who has lofty goals.
Yeah, maybe not so lofty for people who already enjoy wearing hats, but it really couldn't be me. I don't know if anyone else gets this, but I do get like a headache sometimes if I'm wearing a cap or just headwear for too long. But I don't know. Have you tried that?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, I tell people, you're not going to find your perfect sunscreen or your perfect physical blocker on day one. You're going to have to try a bunch of different things, and that's okay. It's okay to do that in the sort of search phase. Find the thing that obviously you like from a visual standpoint, and then in your circumstance, find the one that's light enough or not tight enough so that it's not giving you a headache. From a cap standpoint, I know it's out there for you, Marie. You can find some hat that I promise won't give you a headache. And if you need it, I'll send you a couple of links.
That would be so perfect. I would really appreciate it. I desperately need it. But before we move on to the practices and habits segment to talk a bit more about the everyday application of what you've just shared with us, I would love to know what's one key takeaway regarding aging skin that you would like to leave our listeners with.
Um, I think the takeaway piece that I want to leave people with is that you can simultaneously pursue holistic, healthy aging and understand the benefits of aging while also pursuing the anti-aging elements of a great skincare regimen and skin protective practices. And I think that duality is a really important one.
Yeah, that's an excellent sentiment to have. Now let's move on to the practices and habits segment. So, what is a habit that you would recommend practicing to manage aging skin?
So there's so many that are good. I'm certainly not the only one to be able to tell you the perfect behavior. But to me, we've already gone over most of it, but I want to make sure that someone is exercising. That's the most important thing for all of health. And there's plenty of evidence that it relates right back to not only healthy skin, healthy immune system, but also the visible signs of aging. So exercise, sunscreen, physical protection like a hat. And then if you want an antioxidant on there as well, like a vitamin C, I think is a really simplified, healthy skincare regimen for anybody to pursue. And it can be pretty low cost too.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. It's been such a pleasure to pick your brain about this. I've really enjoyed myself and I've found it to be incredibly insightful, and I hope our audience has as well. Now, let's move on to the open mic segment. This is your opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Please take it away.
Oh, well, Marie, this has just been so fun, and thanks for highlighting this work and what healthy aging skin looks like. I think that's a really important concept that you're really helping us introduce, and I hope your listeners enjoyed as much as I do. I have so many things that I love talking about. My other role is to be a mentor. I mentor a lot of students in my role as the assistant dean of student affairs here, and I just think that that's a real value in life, and certainly from a longevity standpoint, there's a big piece of taking care of others that helps us exist in that state of enjoyment. So just encouraging people to do that. And then I'll tell you that my next mentoring or the next thing I'm going to do is just go take care of my 6-week-old. So I'll go give him a big hug and put our son down for bed.
Oh, that's adorable. What a great use of the open mic. Well, thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
I'm on Instagram. I'm putting some some aging information up there and some skin aging stuff. So my handle is Daniel Butler MD, and feel free to connect with me on there.
Fantastic. We'll leave that in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.